A racist and corrupt cop kicked a black female FBI agent, but froze in fear when she struck back. What happened to him left everyone speechless. He wasn't used to being questioned. Especially not by a black woman in a government-issued suit, walking through his precinct with the kind of confidence that made insecure men like him nervous. The moment she walked through that door, with calm steps and a firm gaze, he already hated her. He didn't need to know her name, her title, or her mission. Her skin color and her presence were enough for him to decide she didn't belong. He stared her down from across the room, leaning back in his chair with the smugness of a man who thought the law answered to him. And as she stepped closer, holding a file that would change the course of his life, he made a decision that would unravel every lie he'd built to protect his power. She approached the front desk with authority. Quiet, focused, precise. She asked to see the precinct captain. The officer leaned forward, glanced down at the badge she flashed, and chuckled. Not just a laugh, it was a public dismissal. A condescending, mocking sound meant to show everyone in the room that he didn't believe she deserved the badge she held. "Where'd you steal that from, huh?" he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Halloween was last month." She didn't flinch. She repeated her request calmly. That's when he stood up. Tall, puffed chest, red-faced. "You think walking in here dressed like one of us makes you one of us?" he said, circling around the desk. "You must think you're really special. Federal badge, huh? What are you, diversity quota?" She still didn't move. But her eyes locked on his, and for the first time, he blinked. He stepped closer, too close, poking her shoulder with his finger. "I said, who let you in here?" She warned him once. Just once. "I'm here on official business. I'd advise you to stand down." That was all. No shouting. No threats. Just law. But he didn't care about the law. Not when it came from her. In front of the other officers, who said nothing, he pushed her. Hard. She stumbled back, caught herself. And then it happened. A swift, deliberate kick to her leg. No hesitation. No justification. Just raw, open hatred. Gasps echoed across the room. She staggered back, gripping the edge of the counter to hold herself upright. The room spun, not because of the pain, but because she knew this moment would change everything. And then she looked up. Eyes locked. And he saw it. Not fear. Not anger. Something colder. Sharper. The moment she stepped forward, he froze. His smirk vanished. His body stiffened like he had seen a ghost. The sound of her voice pierced the silence. "You just assaulted a federal officer." The room collapsed into stillness. What he didn't know was that this wasn't random. She hadn't just walked in. She was there for him. For months, the department had been under quiet federal investigation for racial profiling, brutality, and internal corruption. And at the top of every incident report, every buried complaint, every sealed file, was his name. He'd gotten away with it for years. And now, in a single act of arrogance, he handed her the one thing she couldn't get through files or reports: undeniable, public evidence. The kind that would be played on every screen in America before midnight. But it wasn't just about the kick. Or the slurs. Or the bruised ego of a man who believed his badge put him above judgment. It was about the message. That even in a space meant to serve and protect, a black woman in authority would still be seen as a threat. That even her badge, her title, her service, weren't enough to protect her from the ugliness of racism hiding behind a uniform. He thought she'd walk away. Or break down. Or let it slide. Instead, she reached into her jacket, pressed a button no one noticed, and sealed his fate. Within seconds, agents in plain clothes entered the room, badges raised. The precinct turned into a crime scene. Every officer who stood silent watched their colleague fall from grace. Cameras from her hidden device captured everything. But that wasn't even the beginning of the end. Because what she did next was something no one, not even her colleagues, expected. She exposed something deeper, something that tied that officer to a network of cover-ups, payouts, and broken lives. Families who'd been silenced. Reports that had disappeared. Victims who had given up hope. All because no one had ever stood up in that room the way she just did. The moment he was escorted out in cuffs, trembling, eyes wide in disbelief, people began to whisper, not about what she'd done, but who she really was. Why she came alone. Why this specific precinct? Why him? Why now? And that's the question echoing still. How did she know exactly what would happen, and what secret did she already have that made this moment so much more than justice? Stay with us. Because what comes next will change the way you see power, forever. Before we begin this story, we want to send a powerful message to every Black viewer watching. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in all its forms. This channel believes in the power of truth, representation, and emotional stories that expose what too many still live through, and how justice always finds its way. You are seen. You are valued. You are not alone. We hope this story resonates with you, and above all, reminds you of your strength. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button to support real stories with real meaning. Now, enjoy the story. Newark, New Jersey wasn't the kind of place where you expected clean lines between right and wrong. It had the bones of a once thriving industrial city, now draped in a heaviness that never fully lifted. Abandoned warehouses stood as quiet reminders of lost time, while the streets pulsed with the rhythm of resilience. It was a city where people kept their heads down, not because they didn't care, but because looking too hard into anything meant seeing things you might never forget. The city had a way of swallowing noise. But lately, the silence had been louder than ever. Ayanna Carter moved through that silence like someone who had trained her whole life to blend in, to gather the whispers, to hear what wasn't being said. At 33, she wore her experience like armor, calm, deliberate, heavy with truth. She had grown up just a few blocks from where she now served, raised by a mother who worked night shifts at the hospital and a father who vanished before she could even form the word, Dad. Her childhood taught her not to wait for rescue. And that lesson carved itself deep into the woman she became, an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in internal affairs, the kind that targeted corruption where it was most protected. Ayanna didn't seek the spotlight, she hunted shadows. And she knew, better than anyone, how much darkness could fit inside a uniform. Ayanna wasn't flashy. Her car was modest, her clothes functional, her voice calm. But her mind? That was a machine. She listened more than she spoke, noted everything, and let others underestimate her, until it was too late. She'd earned her place through grit, not favor. Every closed door she faced as a Black woman in federal law enforcement only sharpened her resolve. And when she stood in front of a room, she didn't need to prove she belonged. Her presence alone did that. Still, Newark wasn't ready for her. Not this time. Not for what she came to do. Across town, at the 8th Precinct, things operated under a different kind of law. Officer Robert Kinley had spent over 2 decades working his way into the center of that station. With slicked back hair, a polished badge, and a crooked smile, he looked like the textbook definition of command, if you only looked at the surface. He called himself old school, a man who handled things the way they used to be handled. That was his way of dressing up the truth. Beneath the uniform, Robert was a bully. And not just the kind that barked orders, the kind that made sure anyone who didn't look, talk, or think like him paid for it. He wasn't loud in the way racists are in movies. He was subtle. Strategic. He filled the precinct with people who owed him favors, silenced those who didn't, and built a network of loyalty fueled by fear. The complaints filed against him always got lost in the system. Videos disappeared. Witnesses backed out. And every time someone tried to hold him accountable, the trail ended in red tape. That was the world he ruled, one where he wore the badge not as a symbol of duty, but as a shield from consequence. But Robert's world was starting to crack. It began with whispers. Anonymous tips. Reports of tampered evidence, of unregistered stops, of incidents that were quietly erased. Somewhere in those whispers, one name started to surface too often to ignore: Kinley. And when Ayanna saw that name enough times in files that were meant to be buried, she knew what she had to do. Newark wasn't her assigned territory. But justice didn't care about lines on a map. What mattered was that this man, this officer, had built his power on silence. And she intended to break that silence piece by piece. Her assignment was classified. She didn't enter with sirens or headlines. She came quietly. Moved through the city like she was born from it, because she was. The Bureau didn't question her motives, her record spoke for itself. Over the past 3 years, she had taken down 2 entire precincts through her investigations. Not just rogue officers, entire systems. She knew the risk. But Newark felt personal. Maybe because she still remembered the sting of being pulled over at 17 for walking too close to a white neighborhood. Maybe because the city still bore scars she thought had healed. Or maybe because she understood that men like Kinley didn't just damage cases, they destroyed trust in the idea of justice itself. Ayanna's plan was precise. She studied the precinct's layout, memorized shift schedules, learned who spoke to whom. She tracked patterns, traced reports, and gathered names. Everything pointed to Kinley. But the Bureau needed more. They needed something that couldn't be debated. Not circumstantial. Not hearsay. They needed something that couldn't be erased or rewritten. And that's why she went in alone. Unannounced. Uninvited. Wearing her badge not just as identification, but as a warning. The morning she walked into the precinct, it was business as usual, at least on the surface. Desks cluttered with reports. Phones ringing. Officers making jokes by the coffee machine. Kinley sat behind the front desk, not because he had to, but because he liked to see who walked in. That morning, he noticed her the moment she crossed the door. Noticed her hair pulled tight, her back straight, her gaze level. And something in him twisted. He didn't recognize her. But he knew her type. And in his mind, that was enough to judge her. She approached calmly, asked to speak to the captain. Kinley looked up, slow, his eyes narrowing. Then came the chuckle. The eye roll. The deliberate mispronunciation of agent. His voice rose just enough for others to hear. The jokes were cruel, the tone mocking. What's this? The FBI's doing outreach now. Then louder, to the room, they really lowered the bar, huh? She didn't flinch. That made it worse for him. Because men like Kinley only felt powerful when others shrank. And she didn't. So he stepped around the desk, his voice sharper now. He blocked her path, demanded she show her credentials again, though she already had. She did, steady hand, clear tone. That's when his face changed. From mockery to challenge. Like her calmness was a threat. He pushed her shoulder. Just a little. She didn't move. He pushed harder. Still, nothing. And then came the insult. You think that badge makes you more than you are? And finally, the kick. In that second, the air left the room. The other officers went silent, not from shock, but from fear. Because they knew him. They'd seen this before. And no one ever said a word. But this time, it was different. This time, the silence would not protect him. What Kinley didn't know was that Ayanna had already prepared for everything. She wore a small recording device embedded in her brooch. Her movements were being monitored by 2 agents stationed in a surveillance van just 2 blocks away. Her every word, her every breath, documented. But she hadn't expected him to go that far. She thought he'd intimidate her, maybe humiliate her. But the physical attack? That gave her more than evidence. It gave her momentum. And yet, even as he stood over her, expecting submission, all he saw was control. Stillness. And then, something new, a flash of fear in his own reflection. Because she didn't crumble. She stood back up. Looked him dead in the eye. And with one sentence, she began the unraveling of everything he had built. She knew this wasn't just about her badge, or the pain in her leg, or the stairs in the room. This was about power. And how, sometimes, the quietest people carry the loudest truth. What happened next would leave the country in disbelief. But long before the headlines, before the arrest, before the secrets spilled out, there was this moment. This room. This silence. This woman. And a man who thought he could control it all, until the system he corrupted came knocking at his door wearing the very badge he tried to disgrace. The moment Ayanna stepped out of the precinct that morning, her body still ached from the force of the kick, but her mind was sharper than ever. Every word, every look, every calculated insult from Kinley had landed exactly where she expected. But the violence, the blatant, public assault, shifted something deeper. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was personal. And as the precinct door closed behind her, cutting off the stale, toxic air of that space, Ayanna didn't feel relief. She felt heat rising in her chest, a cold clarity flooding her thoughts. She wasn't done. Not yet. That morning had been just the first move in a game that was finally tilting out of Kinley's control. But she needed to move carefully. Because one misstep, just one, and the entire case could collapse before the truth ever reached daylight. Back in the surveillance van, her two partners, Agent Molina and Agent Pierce, sat in stunned silence, replaying the footage on their monitors. The audio had picked up everything: Kinley's voice, the tension in Ayanna's warning, the thud of the kick. Molina clenched his jaw, fury in his eyes, while Pierce stared at the screen, whispering, "Jesus Christ, he really did it." Ayanna didn't say a word. She took the earpiece out, adjusted her jacket, and simply said, "Send the footage to DC Secure Line. Level 4 clearance. Timestamp everything." She didn't need to watch it again. She'd lived every second. And now, the focus shifted from collecting evidence to executing the strategy she'd been preparing for weeks. The Bureau would want to act fast. But Ayanna knew better. To take Kinley down fully, to expose not just his actions, but the system that protected him, she had to pull every thread until it unraveled in public view. By the afternoon, whispers were already moving through the precinct. Not official statements, those would take days, but rumors, half-truths, curious glances between officers. Kinley pretended to be unfazed, laughing it off like some misunderstanding, as if the footage didn't exist. As if the agents parked outside weren't there for him. In the locker room, he paced. Officer Jules, one of the rookies, watched him closely, hesitant. He approached carefully, asking what had happened that morning. Kinley scoffed, spit on the ground, and said, "Some Fed got a little too full of herself. Thought she could walk in here like she owned the place." Jules nodded, but the discomfort on his face was impossible to hide. Kinley noticed. "You got something to say?" Jules hesitated, then muttered, "I mean, she was a federal agent." Kinley stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "And you think that makes her untouchable?" Jules swallowed hard. "No, sir. I just think, it didn't look good." Kinley stared him down, then walked away without another word. That silence. It was louder than anything he could have said. Meanwhile, Ayanna returned to her temporary office, a windowless federal space rented for field operations, cold and impersonal. She sat down, opened her laptop, and began cross-referencing the names she'd gathered. Reports dating back 15 years. Civilian complaints. Misconduct filings that disappeared. She recognized patterns in the language. Same phrases, same signatures. She knew these weren't isolated incidents. They were coordinated cover-ups. Her fingers moved fast across the keyboard, pulling files, saving backups, building the puzzle. But what shook her most was what she found at the center, a young man named Deshaun Miller, 17 years old, arrested under Kinley's watch 3 years ago. No priors, no record, just a broken arm and a sealed report. The photos were buried deep, watermarked and redacted. But the pain in that boy's eyes told a story she couldn't ignore. And what scared her most was the last note on his file: no further investigation. Complaint withdrawn. Ayanna leaned back, stared at the screen, and closed her eyes. She could hear her mother's voice in her head, from years ago. Baby girl, some battles are won in silence, but the real ones, the ones that matter, they demand a voice. She opened her eyes again, jaw tight. She knew now that Kinley's brutality wasn't a flaw in the system. He was the system. And if she didn't end this the right way, more names would end up in forgotten files, bruised, silenced, erased. The next morning, she returned to the precinct. Not to make a scene, but to finish what she started. The moment she walked in, the atmosphere shifted. Officers paused mid-conversation. Some nodded respectfully. Others avoided her gaze. But she felt the shift. The fear. The recognition. Kinley stood near the back, arms crossed, watching her like a hawk. She approached the front desk and asked, again, to see the captain. This time, no one mocked her. No one laughed. But the captain wasn't in. Not conveniently. She nodded, turned to leave, and that's when Kinley stepped forward. You know, people around here don't take kindly to being threatened, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Ayanna turned slowly. I didn't come here to threaten anyone. I came here to clean up a mess. Kinley smiled coldly. You think this little stunt of yours is going to change anything? She looked at him, unwavering. It already has. There was a long silence. Then Kinley stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think they're gonna protect you when this blows back in your face? These people, they eat their own. Ayanna leaned in, matching his tone. I'm not here to be protected. I'm here to finish what I started. And when it blows back, you'll be the first one it hits. That night, Ayanna sat in her car outside the precinct, staring at the building. Her phone buzzed. A message from Agent Molina, DC approved. Go for full activation. Surveillance greenlit. Confirm when ready. She typed back one word, tomorrow. Then she exhaled deeply, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. Because she knew what was coming. And it would be loud. Across town, Kinley was on the phone, in a dimly lit office, pacing. I don't care what they say, I've got the union on my side. She's just some fed trying to make a name for herself. She doesn't have anything. The voice on the other end was tense. Are you sure? I heard she's got footage. Kinley slammed his fist on the desk. I'm telling you, I've handled worse than this. She'll fold. They all fold eventually. But there was doubt in his voice. A crack. Because deep down, he knew. This time, it was different. The following morning, Ayanna returned. This time, not alone. 2 plainclothes agents followed behind her, unassuming. She walked in with purpose, holding a folder that would make history. She asked for the captain once more. Kinley was already at the desk. His smile faltered. She set the folder down. Inside are 17 reports. 17 cases tied directly to your precinct. 14 under your supervision. 12 with missing evidence. 9 with sealed outcomes. 3 with civilian injuries. 1 with a death. Kinley's face tightened. She wasn't yelling. She didn't need to. Every word landed like a stone. He stepped forward. You come in here, reading off numbers like they mean something. She didn't blink. They mean everything. The room was silent again. Too silent. The agents behind her took small steps forward, not yet acting, just present. Kinley looked around. No one spoke. The power he once felt, it was slipping. And he knew it. Ayanna turned to leave. This is your last chance to cooperate. Tomorrow, I'm not asking questions. I'm filing charges. As she walked out, Kinley's voice cracked behind her. You think you're a hero? You're nothing. You'll be forgotten in 6 months. She paused at the door. Maybe. But by then, you'll be exactly where you belong. The city wasn't quiet anymore. Calls were coming in. Reporters asking questions. Community groups demanding answers. The pressure was building, and the walls were starting to close in. Ayanna watched it all from the edge, never rushing, never forcing the hand, just waiting for the exact moment when everything she set in motion would come crashing down on him. Because tomorrow would change everything. The sky over Newark that morning was thick with clouds, the kind that hang low and heavy, making everything beneath them feel more serious, more final. Ayanna stood in front of the precinct doors, her heart steady but loud in her chest, as if it knew the weight of the hour before her. She adjusted the cuff of her blazer with the same precision she used when loading her service weapon. Only today, the weapon wasn't steel. It was truth. It was every report, every testimony, every second of footage burned onto drives and documented in federal logs. This wasn't a visit. It was an execution. Not of a person, but of a lie that had ruled for too long. She stepped through the glass doors without hesitation, followed closely by agents Molina and Pierce, their faces unreadable, their movements deliberate. The precinct, normally a chorus of movement and idle chatter, had quieted to a hum. Some recognized her immediately, their eyes flickering with tension. Others glanced up with curiosity that quickly soured into dread. A few officers stood frozen near the coffee station, as if by staying still, they could make themselves invisible. At the far end of the room, seated at his desk like a king on a crumbling throne, was Robert Kinley. He looked up, slow, like he expected this. Maybe he had seen it coming. But nothing in his posture showed surrender. If anything, his expression was colder than usual, but the smirk, that twisted, dismissive smirk, was gone. Ayanna walked with the same calm confidence she had always carried, but now, every step echoed louder than before. She stopped just feet from his desk. No badge raised, no words yet. She just looked at him, long and hard, and for the first time, he looked away first. You're early, he said, his voice drier than usual, leaning back in his chair as if trying to signal control. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she placed a small black folder on the desk, then gently turned it toward him. You might want to read that carefully, she said, voice low but firm. Kinley glanced at it, flipping through the first pages. His fingers stopped when he saw the DOJ seal and the signature from the deputy director. His jaw tightened. This is a joke, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Ayanna watched him. It's an official federal order. You're being relieved of duty pending arrest. She kept her eyes on him, searching for the flicker, that moment of fear that often reveals the truth before the words do. But he held himself steady. Barely. Around them, officers exchanged glances, some stepping back, others frozen in place. No one moved to defend him. That part was telling. You think this is justice? He asked after a long pause, closing the folder with shaking hands. You think this is going to fix anything? His voice was louder now, trying to regain footing. You think you've got all the facts? You don't know half of what goes on in this city. Ayanna didn't raise her voice. I know enough. And I know it ends today. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. No, you don't know a damn thing. You walk in here with your perfect suit and your federal clearance like that makes you better than the rest of us. You don't live in this world, agent. You drop in, cause a scene, and leave someone else to clean it up. He stepped closer now, trying to reclaim the same physical intimidation he had once used to humiliate her. But something had shifted. She didn't move. Didn't blink. He felt it. The power was gone. You're not the first one who's tried to come after me, he said, his voice cracking ever so slightly. And they all failed. Ayanna took a small device from her pocket. A sleek, black flash drive. She placed it on the desk next to the folder. That's the footage, she said simply. The full encounter. Audio. Video. Plus every sealed report connected to your name over the last 12 years. Witness statements. Bank transactions. Union memos. Everything you thought was buried. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a near whisper. You didn't just cross a line. You built your career on erasing them. For a split second, Kinley faltered. His shoulders dropped an inch, his lips parted like he wanted to speak but couldn't. And then, like a drowning man reaching for a rock, he laughed. It was bitter, tired. So what now? You want to watch me fall? You want to be the one who gets the headline? The black agent who took down the white cop. His words were meant to cut. But they didn't land. She exhaled slowly, then answered, calm and clear. This was never about color. It was about character. You failed at both. Before he could reply, the double doors to the precinct opened again. A local news crew, tipped off by someone anonymous, walked in with cameras rolling. The tension cracked like ice beneath a boot. The officers turned to watch. Kinley's face drained of color. He looked around, eyes wide. You set me up, he said, almost choking. Ayanna didn't respond. She just nodded at the agents behind her. Now, she said quietly. Agent Molina stepped forward with cuffs. Robert Kinley, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, aggravated assault, civil rights violations, and multiple counts of tampering with evidence. He read each charge like nails into a coffin. Kinley didn't resist. He stood frozen, the cameras capturing every angle. As the cuffs clicked into place, he whispered, "This isn't over." Ayanna leaned close, her voice barely audible. "No, it's just finally beginning." The room held its breath as Kinley was escorted out. Ayanna stood still, watching him go. Not with triumph. Not with revenge. But with resolve. Around her, the silence was no longer compliance, it was realization. Officers looked at her not with fear, but with something new, understanding. For the first time, they saw what real justice looked like. As the doors closed behind him, Agent Pierce turned to Ayanna. You okay? She nodded once. Yeah. But this next part, it's going to be bigger than we thought. She took a deep breath, watching the precinct fall into uneasy stillness. Because what none of them knew yet, what the country was about to find out, was that the footage, the arrests, the exposure, were just the beginning. The files she uncovered had names. Stories. Lives destroyed. Families broken. And she intended to make sure every last one of them was heard. She walked out of the precinct with her head high, passing by cameras, civilians, officers, all watching her like she had just walked through fire and came out whole. And in many ways, she had. But even as her heart steadied, something else lingered, a single question burning in her mind, unanswered. Why, after all this time, did Kinley never try to cover his tracks? And the answer waiting in the shadows, would turn everything upside down. The echo of Kinley's handcuffs locking into place still rang in Ayanna's ears as she walked through the corridors of the federal field office later that evening. Her body was exhausted, the kind of fatigue that lived in the bones, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. The arrest had gone exactly as planned. The footage was secured, the evidence airtight, the media already ablaze with headlines. But even as the weight of justice seemed to settle over the city, something in her gut felt unfinished. A thread still tugged. Kinley's final words, whispered under the hum of the cameras, "This isn't over," echoed with a kind of certainty that didn't match the desperation of a man exposed. And now, as the agents on her team reviewed the aftermath, Ayanna stared at the wall of documents, photographs, and red string lines that filled the room. Everything pointed to Kinley, but something told her that Kinley had never been the brain behind this operation. He was too reckless, too visible. Someone had been helping him cover his tracks all these years, someone who never stepped into the light. Agent Molina stepped into the room, holding a folder with a look that said he'd found something that shouldn't have been found. He handed it to Ayanna without a word. Inside were financial records, freshly subpoenaed, from a private security firm based just outside Newark. But the payments didn't match any of the precinct budgets. They were filtered through back channels, donations, city contracts. And the recipient listed on most of them wasn't Kinley. It was the precinct captain, the very man who had managed to disappear conveniently every time Ayanna asked to speak with him. Captain Ronald Haynes. A man who had stood back and let Kinley do the dirty work, all while presenting himself to the community as a reform-minded leader. Her blood ran cold as she flipped through the records. The captain hadn't just turned a blind eye. He had orchestrated it. Before she could process the full impact, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered instinctively. A low voice came through, steady but nervous. "You don't know me," it said. "But I used to be a junior officer at 8th Precinct. I saw what Kinley did to that kid, Deshawn. I wrote a report, I filed it. A week later, I was transferred out of state with no warning. They told me to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep my badge. But I kept a copy of the file. I didn't know who to trust. Until now." The call ended with a location. An alley behind an old boxing gym near the edge of town. Ayanna didn't hesitate. She didn't bring backup, didn't notify command. She needed answers, and she needed them without interference. When she arrived, the air was cold and damp. A man in his early 30s stepped out of the shadows, cap low, eyes tired. He handed her a worn envelope. Inside were printed pages, medical records, internal emails, a photograph of Deshawn Miller lying on a hospital stretcher, his arm twisted unnaturally, a look of pure terror on his face. The report had been rewritten in the official file. But this version? It told the truth. Deshawn had been beaten, not resisting. No drugs, no weapon, no threat. Just a kid walking home with headphones in. Ayanna's chest tightened as she looked up. The man's voice cracked. "They said he ran. He didn't. I was there. He said, 'I can't breathe,' and Kinley, he just smiled." Ayanna held his gaze. "You did the right thing by coming forward," she said. "We're going to make sure they can't bury this again." The man nodded once, then disappeared into the dark, leaving her alone with a truth too heavy to carry in silence. Back at the office, she worked through the night, connecting dots, building the timeline, redacting nothing. The deeper she went, the more it became clear, Kinley was only a tool. Haynes was the architect. And worse, he had connections to city officials, fundraisers, even federal contacts who had shielded his actions under the guise of stability. The corruption wasn't a crack in the system. It was the system. Ayanna sat back, staring at the wall of evidence. Her pulse was steady, but her breath came slow. She had come to take down one man. Now, she had uncovered a web so deep it reached places she hadn't dared look. The next day, she requested a formal meeting with Captain Haynes. The request was returned with a polite denial. He was out of town. Meetings. City business. Ayanna didn't believe a word. She called his office, direct line. No answer. But an hour later, her assistant handed her a sealed envelope that had arrived through private courier. Inside was a typed letter. No name. No signature. Just a message. Some things don't survive sunlight. Be careful what you bring into the light. Ayana's hand trembled only slightly as she read it. A threat. Subtle, but clear. Someone was scared. Which meant she was close. That evening, against protocol, she walked back into the precinct. Alone. This time, no backup, no folder, no flash drive. Just her. The room buzzed with tension as she entered. Officers stepped aside. Some looked at her with admiration. Others, fear. And then there was Kinley, behind reinforced glass and holding, face bruised from a confrontation earlier that day. His eyes lit up when he saw her. He stood slowly, walked up to the glass, and smiled. Told you it wasn't over, he said. His voice was hoarse. She stepped closer, saying nothing. Just looking. Kinley continued, you think taking me down is the win. You're playing checkers in a chess game. Ayana narrowed her eyes. Then tell me who's moving the pieces. Kinley's smile faded. He leaned in. You already know. You're just not ready to say it out loud. A pause. Then a whisper. Haynes doesn't fall alone. You start that war, you better be ready to finish it. Ayana didn't blink. I didn't come here to start a war. I came to end one. She turned and walked out, not because she didn't want to hear more, but because she already had what she needed. The confirmation. The crack. The arrogance in Kinley's voice, even in a cell, told her everything. He was protected. But that protection was fragile. And now, it was her turn to strike. The next 48 hours were a storm. Ayana gathered every thread, filed the formal indictment, and took the evidence not just to her superiors, but to the press. The Department of Justice was briefed. A federal judge reviewed the material in closed session. The pressure mounted. And then, on a Monday morning thick with anticipation, the warrant was signed. Ayana stood in the hallway of the mayor's office building, dressed in plain clothes, badge tucked inside her coat. She stepped into the elevator, heart calm, mind focused. As the doors opened on the top floor, the security guard stepped back without a word. She walked past them, opened the heavy wooden doors, and found Captain Ronald Haynes sitting at a polished desk, sipping coffee like it was just another day. He looked up, startled but not surprised. Agent Carter, he said, with practiced politeness. To what do I owe? She interrupted him with a document placed in front of him. You're under arrest, Captain. Step away from the desk. Haynes didn't move at first. Just stared at the paper, then at her. You really think this will stick? He asked. You think I haven't survived worse? She didn't argue. She just signaled the agents behind her. We'll let the courts decide. As he was led out in cuffs, reporters outside snapped photos, shouting questions. Haynes kept his head high, but his hands shook. Ayana followed behind, not with satisfaction, but with purpose. She had pulled the thread. And now, the whole machine was unraveling. But just as she was about to leave the building, her phone buzzed with a new message. Deshaun Miller's mother is here. She's asking for you. Ayana paused. Her breath caught. Because this was the moment it had all been for. Ayana stood silently in the hallway of the federal building, her fingertips still cold from the steel of the handcuffs she had placed on Captain Ronald Haynes just minutes before. The sound of the cameras, the flashbulbs outside, the rising chatter of voices, it all faded into a distant hum as she read the message again. Deshaun Miller's mother is here. She's asking for you. 1,000 images rushed through her mind in that moment, fragments of files and photographs, the bruises on Deshaun's face, the desperation in the call from the former officer who risked his entire career to bring her that truth. But none of those images prepared her for what it would mean to face the real consequence of all this, not on paper, but in flesh and bone, in a mother who had lived in the wreckage of silence while men like Haynes and Kinley walked freely under the protection of the system. She walked down the hallway with slow, measured steps, her heels tapping softly on the polished tile floor. When she reached the small interview room where Deshawn's mother waited, she paused at the door. Her breath hitched, not from nerves, but from the weight of the moment. The door opened quietly. Inside, a woman in her early 40s sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes rimmed with years of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could undo. She looked up when Ayanna entered, her gaze not filled with anger or blame, but something deeper. A quiet plea for honesty. For answers. For dignity. Ayanna introduced herself gently, and the woman gave a tired nod. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was soft, but there was a steel thread beneath it. "You're the one who finally did something." Ayanna didn't smile. She didn't feel she had earned the right to. "I'm trying," she said simply. The woman stared at her, eyes narrowing slightly. "Why now? Why did it take 3 years?" That question cut deeper than Ayanna expected. She sat across from her, her voice steady but low. "Because the system was never meant to work for people like your son. And people like me, we have to fight twice as hard just to be heard. I saw what they buried. I saw how they rewrote his truth. I couldn't leave it buried." The woman leaned back, her shoulders sagging under the weight of grief. "He wasn't perfect. He snuck out sometimes, stayed out late. But he was a good boy. And after that night, he never came back the same." Ayanna listened, letting every word settle. "He stopped going to school. He couldn't sleep. He wouldn't talk to anyone. Then one day, he just left. We haven't heard from him in a year. He was scared of everyone. Even me." A silence fell between them, one so heavy it seemed to bend the walls inward. Then she looked up again. "Can you promise me he's going to get justice?" Ayanna didn't rush the answer. "I can promise you he won't be forgotten. And the men who did this, they're going to answer for it. Publicly." That meeting marked a shift for Ayanna. Until then, the case had been about exposure, about bringing down the untouchables. But now, it had become about restoration, about the people left behind, the families who lived in the aftermath of systemic violence and institutional silence. As the news of the arrest spread across the city, reactions were swift and divided. Civil rights groups held vigils, protesters took to the streets with signs that read, "Believe the buried," and "Justice demands memory." But inside law enforcement circles, there was unease. Officers who had long buried their doubts about Kinley and Haynes now faced their own silence. Ayanna began receiving anonymous letters, unsigned, from people who worked under both men, small confessions, regrets, sometimes just single words like, "I knew," or "Forgive me." In the following days, Ayanna testified before a closed federal hearing, presenting the full arc of the investigation. The footage was shown, the financial records outlined, the suppressed reports displayed in sequence. It was undeniable. But what followed wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning. One senator leaned forward after her testimony and asked, "Do you believe this is just the tip of something larger?" Ayanna nodded. "I don't believe it. I know it. This case is one example. But it's not unique. What we uncovered here exists in cities across the country, same tactics, different names." After the hearing, a Justice Department official pulled Ayanna aside. His tone was measured but direct. "You've opened a floodgate. There's going to be resistance. Political, institutional. They'll say you overstepped, that you damaged the department's credibility." Ayanna stared at him, calm. "The credibility was damaged long before I got here. I just exposed it." He gave her a long look, then said, "Be careful. Heroes get replaced faster than villains in this town." She knew what he meant. People like her were only celebrated until they became inconvenient. In the days that followed, Ayanna was offered a transfer. A quiet promotion to a desk in D.C., far from Newark, far from the heat. But she declined. She wasn't done. The files on her desk now had new names, new stories surfacing from communities inspired by what had happened. Whistleblowers were stepping forward. Families were calling her office directly, asking if their case could be reopened. It became clear that the truth didn't end with Haines or Kinley, it only started there. Then came the dilemma. Ayanna received a file through confidential mail, sealed, unmarked, but familiar in format. Inside were documents linking two federal supervisors to the same financial networks that had supported Haines. These were people with power in Washington, people who had signed off on funding for community security programs that were essentially slush funds for suppressing complaints. If she pursued this lead, she would be taking on not just a precinct, but a portion of the bureau itself. She sat with the file in her hands for a long time, staring at the implications. She knew if she opened that door, there would be no turning back. Her badge, her job, even her safety, all would be in jeopardy. She met with Agent Molina that night, laying the file on the table between them. "If we go after this," she said, "we're not just exposing a network. We're challenging the institution we swore to protect." Molina looked at her, eyes hard with clarity. "Then maybe it's time someone did." But there was fear in his voice. Not cowardice, fear of what justice truly demands. Later that week, Ayanna returned to her old neighborhood for the first time in years. A mural of Deshawn had been painted on the side of a community center, his smile wide, untouched by the trauma that followed. She stood in front of it quietly, hands in her pockets, heart heavy. A young boy approached, maybe 12, staring up at the mural, then at her. "Is he the reason you did all this?" he asked. She nodded. "He's one of the reasons." The boy looked back at the wall. "I want to be like him. Brave." Ayanna knelt beside him. "Then promise me something. Don't just be brave. Be loud. Tell your story. Never let anyone rewrite it for you." The boy nodded slowly, and then ran off, leaving her there in the fading light, eyes stinging. The system hadn't changed. Not yet. But something had shifted. People were listening. People were watching. The silence that had protected the guilty for so long was cracking. And Ayanna knew that her fight wasn't over. But for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. And still, a question haunted her. What if the real battle hadn't even begun? It had been 5 days since Captain Ronald Haines was arrested and paraded out of City Hall in cuffs, and the shockwaves were still being felt in every corner of Newark. The city, raw and restless, seemed to hold its breath each morning waiting for the next domino to fall. Inside the federal building, Ayanna's office had become a war room. The energy was taut, the kind that coils beneath the surface when something big is moving in silence. The leads from the confidential file she received days earlier were multiplying. Every time she tugged on one thread, it unraveled into something deeper, older, more rotten than she had imagined. There were handshakes and cover-ups that went back over a decade, funding streams that disguised exploitation as civic engagement, and names she never thought she'd see linked to any of it, including someone she once called a mentor during her early training years in Quantico. But she didn't flinch. She couldn't. The truth didn't allow retreat once it revealed itself. Ayanna sat in a small, low-lit conference room, the file spread out before her like a battlefield. Agent Molina stood across from her, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the documents with the kind of disbelief that comes not from lack of knowledge, but from betrayal. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. "That's not just political mismanagement. That's conspiracy." Ayanna nodded, never breaking her stare from the photograph of two federal supervisors, arms around each other at a fundraising gala tied to the very same security firm that laundered money into Haines' precinct. "We have timelines. We have accounts. This is no longer a corruption case. It's a network. And we're standing in the middle of it. Molina rubbed the back of his neck, the tension in his shoulders giving him away. You realize what happens when you go after names that sit above your own clearance level? She did. She knew exactly what it meant. She was already hearing rumors of a quiet reassignment coming down from DC, murmurs of Ayanna being too aggressive or emotionally compromised, coded language meant to strip her power while preserving the image of the institution. She leaned forward, pressing her fingers to the table, steadying herself. I didn't come this far to take down a captain and walk away while the real architects stay hidden behind foundation galas and press conferences. Her voice didn't shake. But something about the way she said it made Molina pause. He saw something in her eyes, the weight of 100 silent stories. You're not going to let this go, are you? He asked. She looked up at him. Would you? He shook his head slowly, then sat down beside her. Then I guess we do this together. That same afternoon, Ayanna was scheduled to meet with the mayor, a public conversation about reforms, a symbolic gesture to show the city that justice was moving forward. She didn't want the theater, but she needed the leverage. When she arrived at City Hall, the mayor greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He gestured for her to sit in a private conference room, away from the media, and poured himself a glass of water before speaking. I want to thank you, he said carefully, for handling this case with professionalism. What you exposed was shocking, and the city owes you a debt. Ayanna didn't smile. She studied him. It's not over, she said plainly. The mayor paused, his glass halfway to his lips. Excuse me. Ayanna pulled a document from her bag and slid it across the table. I have reason to believe that city funds were rerouted through civic programs tied directly to your campaign donors. I'm not accusing you. Yet. But I am saying, I won't stop pulling until I find where it leads. The air between them shifted. The mayor set the glass down slowly. You're playing with fire, Agent Carter. She nodded. And you're sitting in gasoline. He leaned back, his face tightening. You go public with this and you'll be dismantling half of Newark's leadership infrastructure. Do you understand the chaos that would create? Her response was immediate. I understand the chaos that already exists when no one's held accountable. The room fell into a silence thick with challenge. Then the mayor exhaled, slow and tired. What do you want? Ayanna didn't blink. Full access to all discretionary spending tied to the precincts. A task force with civilian oversight. And protection for the whistleblowers who are starting to come forward. He stared at her, weighing his options. That's a lot to ask. Ayanna leaned in. Not as much as they've taken. Later that evening, Ayanna returned to the federal building to find a woman waiting in the lobby. It was Deshawn's mother. Again. But this time, she wasn't alone. A young man stood beside her, hoodie pulled low, hands shaking. Ayanna's breath caught. She recognized him instantly. Deshawn. His eyes were different now. Hardened. Watchful. The kind of eyes that had seen too much too young. He didn't speak at first. Just looked at her like he was searching for something, maybe a reason to trust, maybe proof that she wasn't just another agent making promises. Ayanna stepped closer, speaking softly. Deshawn. I've been hoping I'd get to meet you. He shrugged, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. I wasn't gonna come. I thought, what's the point? She nodded slowly. I understand. You've been through more than anyone should have to carry. But your voice matters. Your truth matters. And we're finally in a position where people are willing to hear it. He looked down. I can't sleep. I still see his face. That night, I kept thinking, if I'd fought back, maybe he'd have stopped. But I was scared. I didn't want to die. Ayanna felt her throat tighten. You did the bravest thing you could. You survived. Deshawn looked up, his expression shifting. They said you made him pay. That true? Ayanna nodded once. He's not the only one. And we're not done. Deshawn glanced at his mother, then back at Ayanna. If I tell my story, it's gotta be on camera. I want people to see my face. I don't want to be a name on some file anymore. Ayanna smiled, a real one this time. You won't be. The next day, Deshawn's testimony aired publicly, broadcasted across multiple networks. His voice, trembling but firm, painted a vivid, gut-wrenching picture of what it meant to be young, black, and criminalized for existing. He didn't embellish. He didn't cry. He just told the truth. And the city listened. Some wept. Some raged. Some denied. But no one could ignore him. And that was the beginning of something much bigger than Ayanna could have planned for. More victims came forward. Officers resigned. One precinct dissolved entirely under internal pressure. The Department of Justice opened a national probe based on Ayanna's casework. And the story reached beyond Newark, into other cities where silence had ruled for too long. Still, Ayanna knew the system would fight back. It always did. People in power didn't give up control, they manipulated it, hid behind policy, turned one another into scapegoats. And that's when she faced her hardest decision yet. One of the names in the file, one of the federal supervisors funding the shadow programs, was someone Ayanna had once worked for, someone who had mentored her in the early years, who helped her navigate her first major field case. His signature was on a contract that funneled federal money through a nonprofit that had indirectly funded Haines Precinct. It wasn't just betrayal. It was personal. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it. He sat back in his leather chair, eyes tired, voice calm. I thought we were doing the right thing, he said. Keeping neighborhoods stable. Keeping people safe. Ayanna shook her head. You funded oppression. You protected predators. You buried truth. He looked at her with something like regret. I believed in you, he whispered. And now you're going to tear this all down. She took a long breath. No. I'm going to rebuild it. And just like that, she walked away from one chapter of her life, straight into the fire of another, not as a field agent chasing criminals, but as a woman forcing the mirror in front of an entire institution. But the question still lingered, heavy as ever. What happens when the fight for justice starts turning people you once respected into your enemies? The days that followed Deshawn's televised testimony were unlike anything Ayanna had ever experienced in her career. Her face, once familiar only in closed federal circles, now flashed across television screens, on social media feeds, in community town halls and late-night news commentary. People called her courageous, unshakable, heroic. But inside, she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman walking a tightrope strung between truth and institutional vengeance. Every email she opened, every phone call that rang, carried the weight of expectation and consequence. Some were thank yous from families whose stories had been buried and were now surfacing into the daylight. Others were threats veiled in formalities, reminders that she was not untouchable, that her badge couldn't protect her from the shadow network she had begun to expose. One morning, just after sunrise, Ayanna found herself sitting alone in her apartment for the first time in weeks. The case files were gone from her table, replaced by an untouched bowl of cereal and a blinking cursor on her laptop. Her apartment, usually a sanctuary of order and stillness, now felt heavy with the presence of everything she had stirred up. She stared at the blinking cursor, unsure what to write. Her final report was due in 48 hours, and with it, the full official narrative of the investigation that had shattered not just precinct walls but federal corridors of power. She closed the laptop with a sigh and reached for her phone. No messages from the bureau. Not a single word. That silence said more than any statement could. They were watching. Waiting. Weighing whether to stand behind her or distance themselves once the dust settled. Later that morning, Ayanna walked into the federal office and was met with an unexpected scene. Dozens of people were lined up outside the lobby, holding signs not of protest, but of solidarity. Photos of Deshawn, quotes from her interviews, banners that read, "Accountability is patriotism," and "We stand with Agent Carter." She hadn't asked for this. She never wanted to be a symbol. But it had happened, and now, whether she liked it or not, she was a living challenge to the very system she once vowed to serve without question. Agent Molina met her at the elevator, looking more worn than usual. His voice was quiet. "We need to talk. Upstairs." She followed him into a secure conference room, where Agent Pierce was already seated, files spread out before him. On the table were internal memos, some marked classified, discussing reassignment, surveillance clearance reduction, and a potential internal affairs review opened against her for procedural overreach. Ayanna stared at the documents, expression unreadable. Molina said what Pierce wouldn't. "They're coming for you." "Not officially." "Not yet. But they're testing the ground." She picked up one of the memos and read it silently, her pulse steady. "So exposing a federal-level cover-up of civil rights violations is now considered overreach?" Pierce looked at her with something close to guilt. "You didn't play it their way. You didn't loop in the right people. You went public without permission." Ayanna met his eyes. "I didn't ask for permission because I wasn't going to get it. They would have buried it again." Molina stepped in, his tone sharp. "We know that. We've always known that. But now they see you as a liability." She dropped the memo back on the table and took a step back. "So what's the plan? Let them sideline me while they quietly sweep the rest of it under the rug?" Pierce stood. "You're not alone, Ayanna. There are people in D.C. who believe in what you've done. But they're not going to stick their necks out until they see how this lands. You have momentum. But they have power." Ayanna exhaled slowly, her jaw tight. "Then I'll keep moving. Let them try to catch up." That afternoon, she met with Deshawn again, not in a conference room, not behind a desk, but outside, in the open air of Lincoln Park where they could speak freely. He wore a hoodie again, but this time it wasn't pulled low. He sat on the bench, his posture more relaxed than before, though still cautious. Ayanna sat beside him, not saying anything at first. Just letting the wind fill the space between them. Eventually, Deshawn spoke. "I didn't expect people to care. I thought I was just another kid who got beat up and left behind." Ayanna nodded, her voice soft. "That's what they wanted you to believe." He turned to her. "So what now? You got the captain, the cop. You did what no one else could." She hesitated. "We exposed the truth. That's not the same as fixing it." Deshawn leaned back, his eyes scanning the park. "I've been thinking about talking at schools. Telling kids what really happens. Maybe then they won't freeze like I did. Maybe they'll know what to do." Ayanna felt her throat tighten. "You froze because you were human. That's not weakness, Deshawn. That's survival." He looked at her, eyes wide. "And what are you doing? Surviving? Or fighting?" She didn't answer right away. Then, both. The next morning, the Internal Affairs Review was officially confirmed. Ayanna received a letter marked urgent, demanding a meeting to discuss conduct unbecoming and breach of chain-of-command protocol. It wasn't just a warning. It was a trap. An attempt to discredit her, to paint her as emotional, unstable, reckless. She sat in the waiting room outside the review board's office, her badge heavy on her hip, her thoughts clear. When her name was called, she stood with calm dignity and entered the room. Inside, four senior agents sat behind a long table, folders open, expressions neutral. The lead investigator, a woman in her 60s with the hard stare of a lifer, gestured for Ayanna to sit. Agent Carter, she began, "You've been summoned to discuss actions taken during and after the investigation of Captain Ronald Haynes and Officer Robert Kinley. Do you understand the scope of this review?" Ayanna nodded. "I understand." The woman continued. "Your methods, though effective, bypass standard reporting procedure, including early media engagement, which some consider a violation of Bureau protocol." Ayanna didn't flinch. "If I'd followed standard procedure, Haynes would still be walking free." One of the other agents leaned in. "Be that as it may, we must assess whether your actions have set a precedent that undermines the chain of command." Ayanna looked around the room. "You mean, did I make it harder for future agents to be silent?" There was a beat of silence. Then the lead investigator spoke again. "You've put the Bureau in a difficult position." Ayanna nodded once. "Good. That means we're finally having the right conversation." The room tensed, but no one interrupted her. She continued. "We don't get to hide behind policy while communities are being terrorized. We don't get to preach justice and practice silence. I won't apologize for doing what the Bureau should have done years ago." The lead investigator leaned back. "Do you want to remain an agent?" Ayanna met her eyes. "I want to remain a force for truth. If this badge supports that, I'll wear it. If not, I'll keep fighting without it." They dismissed her after that, no decision made, no outcome given. Just a vague promise to deliberate. But Ayanna knew what was coming. She would either be reprimanded quietly or forced out publicly. Still, she walked out of that building with her spine straight, knowing she had spoken the truth in a place designed to suppress it. That evening, as she walked the streets of Newark, she passed by the mural of Deshawn again. A new line of graffiti had been added in bold paint beside it, "Justice isn't polite. It's necessary." She smiled, not with joy, but with resolve. Because despite everything, the fight was changing. People were rising. Voices were multiplying. And no matter what the Bureau decided, she had already become something more than an agent. She had become a spark. But even sparks can burn. And she had no idea how far the fire would spread next. The final decision from the Bureau came quietly, as Ayanna had expected. No press conference, no statement, no scandal to acknowledge. Just an internal memo slipped into her inbox, informing her that she would not be terminated, but neither would she be advanced. Her actions were deemed commendable in result, but problematic in process, a bureaucratic phrase meant to save face without conceding ground. They offered her a reassignment to a lower-profile division in a different state, far from Newark, far from everything she had exposed and everyone she had fought for. But Ayanna didn't take the reassignment. She didn't argue. She simply submitted her resignation, packed up her office, and walked away from the title that once meant everything to her. Because the truth was, she didn't need the badge anymore. Her integrity, her purpose, her fire, it had never come from the Bureau. It had always come from her. Deshawn Miller, with the strength he rediscovered through truth, began traveling to schools, youth centers, and community events, sharing his story with a voice that trembled less each time he spoke. His pain hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. He was no longer a name buried in a report. He was a face, a voice, a symbol of survival and resistance. He and Ayanna kept in touch. He often called her after a speech, sometimes excited, sometimes shaken. She always answered. And slowly, the boy who once disappeared into fear began to rebuild a life no longer defined by what was done to him, but by what he chose to do with it. Officer Kinley pled guilty in a negotiated deal, avoiding the full weight of a public trial. It was a decision made to spare Deshawn and other victims from re-traumatization, but it came with conditions: public admission of guilt, full cooperation with federal investigations, and a lifetime ban from any law enforcement or security position. Kinley, stripped of everything that once gave him power, lived out his days in silence and isolation. His name, once spoken with fear inside the precinct, became a cautionary tale. Captain Ronald Haynes, however, did not fold. He fought every charge, hired a legal team with deep political connections, and waged a loud, bitter campaign to paint himself as a victim of bureaucratic witch hunts. But the documents Ayanna uncovered, the testimonies she secured, and the undeniable proof of the system he created were too strong. After a long and public trial, he was convicted on multiple federal counts, sentenced to 17 years. As he was led out of the courtroom in shackles, there were no protests, no outrage. Just the heavy silence of a city watching the fall of a man who had believed he was untouchable. Ayanna didn't return to law enforcement. Instead, she founded an independent investigative nonprofit that partnered with local communities to expose corruption and advocate for transparency in public institutions. The organization grew quickly, attracting other former agents, journalists, lawyers, and community leaders. She didn't operate from a position of vengeance, she moved from principle, building systems of truth outside the walls of the institutions that had once tried to silence her. She wasn't chasing justice anymore. She was building it. Months later, she was invited to speak at a national summit on justice reform. Standing before a crowd of thousands, Ayanna looked out across the sea of faces, activists, lawmakers, survivors, skeptics, and began not with policy, but with a name. Deshaun Miller, she said, was the reason I stayed when it got hard. He was the reason I chose to fight, not from inside a system that fears truth, but outside, where truth has space to breathe. The crowd was silent, absorbing every word. She spoke of power, of silence, of the high cost of standing up and the even higher cost of staying down. And when she finished, she didn't ask for applause. She asked for courage. In the years that followed, Ayanna's work would inspire legislation, launch accountability platforms, and help bring to light injustices that would have otherwise remained hidden. She was no longer just the agent who took down Kinley and Haynes. She became a movement. A force of transformation. Her name was no longer whispered in caution behind closed doors, it was spoken aloud, with respect, with gratitude, with fire. But none of it came easy. The journey had cost her friendships, career stability, and the comfort of safety. She had faced sleepless nights, surveillance, political smear campaigns, and moments when she questioned whether the truth was enough. But then she would see a letter from a teenager who found the courage to speak up because of her story, or a family that finally saw justice for a brother taken too soon, and it reminded her why she had chosen this path. The most powerful change doesn't come from titles or institutions. It comes from people willing to risk something for what is right. From the voices that refuse to be silenced. From the ones who choose to stand even when it's easier to sit back and survive. Ayanna chose to stand. And because she did, others rose with her. Now let me ask you, the one listening, the one sitting in a room where injustice might not always wear a uniform or carry a weapon, what would you have done? What would you risk for the truth? Would you walk away once you saw the cracks, or would you pull until the walls came down? Because this story isn't just about Ayanna. It's about all of us. About the systems we uphold, the silence we tolerate, and the justice we're willing to demand. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged something inside of you, drop your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice be part of something that matters. And don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that shake, stir, and speak. Because the truth deserves to be told, loudly, unapologetically, and with purpose.